advice do you guys have for procurement professionals as they navigate the new normal that's obviously happening with inflation, global uncertainties, and the continuous supply chain challenges?
Yeah, and I don't think there's any silver bullet other than the first thing you need to realize is that this is a new normal, I think. Everyone's been waiting for this pandemic to pass, and you can argue where we are in that process, and then all of a sudden other exogenous events have popped up, and I think with 7 billion people on the planet, we're going to be dealing with exogenous events that are impacting and disrupting the business world for the foreseeable future. So what does that mean? What are we seeing from the procurement people that we interact with? The first thing is a recognition that what they've been doing in the most recent future or over the long haul, as we deal with a lot of Fortune 100 companies at C2FO, is the solutions and the practices and the processes that they've had in place that have worked aren't necessarily working now. There's no magic bullet for getting the ships to go through the port of Long Beach these days. I think the biggest message that I've seen, Kitty can lump onto this, is the old answers aren't necessarily the right answers today. You need to think outside the box, rely on third people to bring expertise that can be really helpful to you.
Yeah, great. I mean, and I have conversations with members every single day. So what kinds of options do those organizations need to provide to ensure their suppliers have access to things like working capital that's affordable, fast, easy, and a cheaper option as well?
Yeah, and our session is really focused on strengthening supplier relationships, and I think that, and we're biased because we come from a platform that's working capital focused, but as our phones rang, as we've had more and more discussions, what's really populated to the top of the need is supplier health, and the number one way to contribute to that is liquidity. So whether you're a large strategic supplier that has as much leverage with a customer, or you're a diverse supplier at the tail, or a very small supplier, liquidity is still front and center of any company these days. So finding ways to get liquidity to your supply chain, whether you have it on your own balance sheet or can take advantage of a fintech like we are at C2FO to use third-party liquidity, banks, hedge funds. There is a lot of capital out there to be put to work, especially at the top end of the credit profile, and especially at the diversity and inclusion side of the equation, that ESG that everyone's focused on. So liquidity is really the best way, or the most predominant way right now that we see people focusing on trying to solve potential issues that have been lingering with their supply chain. If you get them the capital, get them liquidity. Kitty focuses on payment terms. She could talk about that in a second. Cash is king, and cash to your suppliers can help them unlock some of the things that they're struggling with.
Absolutely. And even before I came over to C2FO and then on to Pendulum, I worked at a fairly large global company, and I was responsible for their global supply chain finance program. And one of the things that I kept hearing from suppliers, the large suppliers were joining these programs, but the small and medium suppliers didn't have access, to discount their invoices if they wanted to. So I kept getting these phone calls, and so I decided to do some research and heard about fintechs, and being in procurement, I was like, what is a fintech? So I actually, did some search, came across C2FO, and spoke to someone there, and they said, yeah, we can come along your bank SCF programs and complement and take care of those small suppliers. So that's one of the things that is really critical, and I think, like Stu said, getting some type of early pay solution in place is definitely key for your suppliers.
And I think you really hit the nail on the head with the liquidity and having options and why you should really help your suppliers out during this time. So what's kind of the key to collaborating with suppliers while aligning them to companies' payment terms, policies, given this is such an important aspect of any company's working capital strategy and cash conversion cycle?
Yeah, at C2FO, what we do is we have an early payment marketplace, right? So what that enables us to do is help companies pay their suppliers early. And the enabler to that is every day we're getting an accounts payable feed that is basically summary invoice information. So we're not getting pricing or quantity or anything. We're basically getting, here's an invoice, the suppliers render their goods and services, we've approved this invoice and we're going to pay it in 60 days or 90 days. And we want you to present this to our suppliers, bring them to this tool, and let them tell you what it's worth to get paid early, i.e. tomorrow, rather than waiting 60 days. And they, in our platform at least, there's competitors out there, but they can make an offer of what it's worth to them. A small company may have very expensive factoring or banking solution or banking lines, where a 2% discount is a very attractive way to get paid early versus factoring their receivables through the programs that they may have. So what that does is it gives a supplier a very unique and controllable way to get paid early, but it gives us a data set of which we can really use information to help companies segment their suppliers. So to think that you're going to go treat like a Mars, who's the biggest candy company in the world that sells to Walmart as their biggest supplier, the same way you're going to treat the smallest company in your supply chain. There's no solution in the world that's going to be one size fits all. So using data to segment your supply chain is probably one of the best things we see happening today. Understand who your strategic suppliers are, understand who your core suppliers are, and then understand on the tail, who are the small and medium, who are the diverse, and you can set up programs, with a platform like ours or others, and dial those needs in differently than just treating them all with one. And that's true of early payment, it's true of payment terms. You may not want to have the same payment term approach to all your suppliers, right? You may not be able to have the same, but you also don't want to have 500 different payment terms if you can help it from a management perspective. So that's some of Kitty's expertise. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what we do at Pendulum is we do payment terms optimization. So we could take a client's spend file and we automatically go through and we look at the diverse suppliers. We don't want to push diverse suppliers out to long term, so we may want to kind of carve them out at a lower term. We look at different categories. We actually will map your vendor categories to SIC codes. And then that's where we do some of the benchmarking and to find what are the best terms, globally or, regionally, we will go through and do that segmentation for you. And then we actually do a full turnkey solution. So we will send letters out to your suppliers with your company letterhead, and we will do the full communication with the suppliers, because I know that you guys are probably strapped with a lot of other stuff, so that's something that we can do for you. So definitely payment terms optimization is a good tool to have too.
One of our clients that became a client shortly after the pandemic started, probably April of 2020, is this 100-year-old conservative industrial company, very well-known name. They have a little bit of aerospace and defense business, and they make heavy equipment. And I've been talking to them for years, and to get them to do anything different than the way they've done it for the last 100 years was virtually impossible. But a couple things happened. One, the pandemic happened, but the other thing is they hired a new procurement team, basically a CPO, a VP of procurement finance, and a couple other folks on that team came in, lifted from another company. And they really challenged the status quo. They used the pandemic as a way to kind of stimulate that change of thought. But a company that hadn't changed payment terms with their suppliers in probably 20 years all of a sudden went out with a full-blown segmentation and went out with a very targeted payment terms effort that they were probably thinking about doing before the pandemic and was going to be more broad scale, but the pandemic hit and they were thinking, okay, we can't push out terms to our most critical suppliers. That'd be defeating the purpose. We want to be most friendly to them. But we also need working capital, so let's push out terms in a very structured, data-driven manner. So they did that, and on the heels of that, they rolled out an early payment tool to kind of soften the blow or the pressure that payment terms put on. So it's very similar to what banks have been doing in supply chain finance for a long time, but those programs are mature, not a lot of help from the bank. They pretty much give you the tool and make you go do it yourself. And they really just get your top 10 or 12 suppliers is the focus of those programs. But this 100-year-old company, totally surprised the heck out of us, basically, that they changed behavior. It was driven by new leadership, a new way of thinking. And then they've rolled out other things. They put in some spend analytic cubes that they would never have done before. So back to my earlier comments, they're leveraging third-party expertise and solutions that they would never have done before. Partly driven by new people in new places, but also driven by a new world that we're functioning in today.
One thing that I wanted to kind of touch base on, because obviously you can't do this in a silo, right? So cross-functional collaboration with IT, with finance. So how can, we always talk about why is this important? I think everyone now knows why. So how can procurement practitioners really develop better relationships with Treasury and other teams as well?
And from what we see, we have our solution, both of our solution, when you touch working capital, innately that requires focus on a couple elements, right? It focuses on DPO, right? So you're naturally dealing with your procurement and AP teams inside. It's focusing on your sales. DSO is part of the cash conversion cycle. Inventory is part of working capital. So projects like this naturally force companies to come to the table cross-functionally and collaborate. So I think one of the simple answers is when you tackle a project that has those multiple stakeholders forced to be involved, we also need IT in our platform to do some light work. We've seen that people get in a room for our kickoff to roll these platforms out, and half of them never met each other before. And then 3 months after we're done with the project, we've seen some of the barriers broke down. So a lot of it's forced collaboration by just tackling a project that goes across functions in terms of what the characteristics of it are.
Yeah, when I was running the global supply chain finance program, so I went from procurement and then got tapped on the shoulder to run this project, which I was like, what is working capital? Why is DPO important? I don't get it. I'm a procurement person. So first thing that I did was, meet the Treasury team. Well, Treasury, I just think money, but I wasn't quite sure what they did. So started spending time with them. They started learning how I did procurement, and suddenly we're traveling around the world, rolling out the supply chain finance. So it's definitely a collaboration thing, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, they probably have questions of what we do, so ask questions of the Treasury folks too.
I think what's also happening is organizationally, companies are shifting the way they roll up their organizations. So they're either, a lot of times procurement now reports to CFO, and a lot of you in the room may object vehemently to that being the way it plays out. But that obviously that does create forced collaboration. But the other side of the equation, a lot of companies are putting CFOs within procurement organizations. So whether it's a finance role or a CFO title itself underneath procurement. And we've seen that make incredible strides in terms of getting companies to think differently about solutions, whether it's liquidity and working capital like we're talking about, or just in general, having a better strategy to go to market with when you have that type of knowledge and expertise. You might not have to rely on the Treasury person, just take a Treasury type person, embed that type of expertise inside your organization at procurement that allows you to communicate more effectively. Like Kitty said, she didn't even know really what Treasury did, right? But if you have someone that's ex-Treasury or a Treasury type background and they're part of the procurement team, there's a natural bridge that gets connected there and helps companies work more effectively internally.
How do you guys motivate your teams as you're, thinking about this, and maybe what should other procurement organizations think about with motivation for thinking a little bit differently about supplier relationships and strengthening those?
I've been at C2FO for almost 9 years, a fintech company. And the reason why I'm there is every day is challenging. So I think technology and some of these things that we just talked about that you can bring to your organization rather than doing things the same way that they've been done for the last 10 years or 100 years in some cases. It's not a great answer. I'm not sure if, there's probably behavioral scientists out there that probably have better answers, but people, especially the next generation that's entering the workforce, they think about things differently. You gotta have exciting roles for people, and you gotta find creative ways to make those roles exciting.
And be open to learning. I mean, continuously learning new things, and that'll help motivate you and your team.